Hello and welcome to another Future Narrative. Today I wanted to talk about destruction and creation. So basically, destruction and creation are two of the most prominent interactions in video games. And I was just thinking, which one is more satisfying, basically? This is an interesting question because it's not like a rhetorical question or anything. It's something I don't quite know the answer to. So basically, many modern video games, particularly sort of shooting games, obviously, focus on just destruction. Not just like destruction of property, but destruction of lives, destructions of people's ideals, destruction of plans, etc., etc. And there's something kind of quite ironic, I think, about how like a lot of modern warfare games tend to be about stopping nuclear threat, which is, as anyone who's looked into the Cold War knows, is all about mutually assured destruction, like destruction of everything, of everyone, of the whole world. And yet, to go about stopping this destruction, they do it by destroying everything and anyone in their way. Think about like Battlefield 3 or Modern Warfare 3. These things about nukes and car bombs and things. Stopping these sort of big weapons of mass destruction, and yet what do you do the whole game? You basically go around blowing up buildings, blowing up people, firing rockets into things. So it's kind of silly when you think about it, but a lot of video games focus on this idea of destruction. Like, destruction is awesome, basically. I mean, there's no denying that it's fun to like fire a rocket launcher into like a tower or something, or everyone's been there. You fire like you throw a grenade at a bunch of boxes or something, and then the grenade blows up, everything flies everywhere, and it's really satisfying. It's satisfying to destroy something because it's very cathartic. It's tapping into some sort of primal urge, I think. If you look at games like the Bad Company series or Just Cause 2 or the Red Faction games, they all base their gameplay around this idea of destruction physics, or a lot of it is based around this idea of destruction physics. They've built these very intricate game engines that heavily focus on this idea of buildings and obstacles and things built around these component parts, and then that's when you fire the rocket into the pylon or whatever it is that you're doing, then the pylon falls apart. It feels really good in the way that a lot of games can't quite get right, and it shows that in terms of destruction and getting enjoyment out of destruction in games, is a lot of it depends on how the things that you're destroying are specifically constructed. In terms of Bad Company, you're blowing holes through walls. And then it's fun to also, in terms of the Red Faction games as well, it's fun to sort of take out the foundations of a tower and then watch the whole thing collapse. And it's very much like if you've ever been on the beach, if you've ever seen a sandcastle on the beach and then had this desire to sort of jump on it, then you're a dick. But also, it's a very kind of natural thing to sort of destroy something that's quite intricate and looks like it took a very long time to build and put together. Whereas if it's just something like a cardboard box, it's not as fun to sort of kick a cardboard box to pieces or whatever, because it's just it's not as fun. It's not as anarchic, I suppose you would say. The problem is when a game consists only of blowing things up, like the example that struck me particularly in 2011 was Gears of War 3, and the entire game was purely based around the idea of just shooting monsters and blowing up things. And if you look at some of the earlier examples, like Just Cause 2 is a really fun game, but it's fun because it's not just about blowing things. Well, it kind of is just about blowing things up, but there's other stuff thrown into the mix as well, like driving speedboats, racing things, driving. Driving missions. That's pretty much all I've got, I think. What else was there in Just Cause 2 that was fun? Parachuting around places, finding collectibles, things like that. You don't get that in Gears of War 3, and it stops being fun when the only thing you're doing for an entire 10-hour campaign is just blowing things up, destroying things. What's the counterpoint to this? And the counterpoint to this is creation. So what sort of games would feature creation as a major part of their appeal? Three obvious examples are The Sims, Minecraft, and Little Big Planet. Those are three kind of quite recent games that are based more around the idea of creation than destruction, but also have destruction as part of their gameplay, and that's kind of a big part of their appeal. I mean, if you think about The Sims, I think it's as fun to build up a family and watch them all sort of grow up and everything, and watch these little. It's kind of like a little anthill with a bit of Charlie Chaplin thrown in. That's how I would describe the appeal of The Sims. It's like having a little ant farm, but it's got a lot of sort of slapstick charm to it, which is kind of my counter argument when people sort of say, oh, why not go and enjoy real life? It's like, well, it's not exactly like real life. But anyway, it's as fun to sort of create all the characters and create the house and put all the things in the house, decide what colour the sofa's going to be, decide what kind of carpet they're going to have, and then you do all that, and then the kid goes to college, and then all that. Then, well, if you're like me, and I know I'm not the only person who thinks like this, you kind of feel this urge to sort of throw a massive spanner in the works. So what do? You like remove the smoke alarm and leave something burning on the stove, and then everything burns down. You take the ladder out of the pool, you remove all the toilets, you do something that's going to cause some sort of havoc in your finely constructed household. In the same way, like Minecraft, obviously a lot of the appeal isn't just the fact that you can just make stuff. You kind of have to work to get the materials to build your castle or whatever, and then there are all these there's more sort of traditional game-like elements in there, so you have to sort of fend off monsters and things like that. So that works really well, because again, if it was just about creation and nothing else, I think you would kind of lose something as well, in the same way that if it was just about destruction, you stop being fazed by it. There's another good examples of Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, which is not a good example necessarily of destruction, but I think in terms of using creation in a way that's quite compelling, that you have to sort of create these vehicles, but it's not just creating vehicles for their own sake. I mean, if you look at a lot of games that have sort of vehicle creation, I can usually never be bothered with that in terms of things like the Forza games, stuff like that. It's like, oh, you can customize your car to the finest details. Oh, great, okay. I can't be bothered there. In that regard, it's nice to have that creation feeling like it's fulfilling some sort of purpose, other than being like 0.55 kilometers faster or whatever. I don't care. Just give me a supercar or something like that. But then in Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, it was quite good to sort of have it more sort of focused around solving puzzles and things like that. There's another sort of thing in terms of like the idea of having only destruction. If you think of Half-Life 2, Dr. Breen, the sort of central antagonist of the piece, if you like, there's a bit near the end of Half-Life 2 where Dr. Breen comes up on a monitor and says, the exact words are, "Tell me, Dr. Freeman, if you can. You have destroyed so much. What is it exactly that you have created? Can you name even one thing? I thought not." So I thought that was quite a profound moment, and then it's quite funny as well that obviously you might not even hear that speech because you might have just ripped the monitor off the wall and then thrown it into an abyss or something. So it's the kind of thing you can only really get away with once or twice, because obviously it's not your fault that the designers made a game that's purely around like blowing things up. But then in the same way, Half-Life 2 has a lot of other stuff going for it as well. That it's not just about shooting stuff. There's there's puzzles to solve, there's environments to explore, and then that all comes together quite nicely. So in a way, BioShock tried to do a similar thing with the whole golf club scene. And that's a really clever thing to do, but again, I think you can only really get away with it once or twice, and before it's like, well, yeah, can't you just make more sophisticated experiences now? You prove that shooters are kind of linear, and don't have much choice. It's mostly about killing stuff. Okay, right, yeah, very clever, very very meta. And I love BioShock, don't get me wrong, but I think you can only really do that a couple of times before it's like, well, just sort of make the better game already. And another example of creating a character. You get a lot of character creation. So a good example of that would be like the Mass Effect games. One thing I really like about that. And I'm kind of cynical when it comes to character creation, because a lot of the time you don't get a lot of choice, and in the end I'd rather just have one well-defined character. If you're only going to give me a choice of beards or something like that, like Alpha Protocol instantly springs to mind, where it's like you're given something like 5 hairstyles and 2 different types of facial hair, and it's like, I'll just make one well-defined character and have done with it. I really don't care what kind of beard he has. I'd rather he just had something you'd thought through a bit more carefully. But with the Mass Effect games, I think you're given just about enough leeway in terms of the number of options you're given to create this character, and that can help to sort of attach yourself to that character, particularly if it's going to be a very long game. And Mass Effect, in terms of like the way that you can import that character, that works really well, and that's something that you've created. It's something that's probably going to be unique to you, and even obviously you can't provide infinite options, and at some point you're going to realise, well, you probably do have the same shepherd as another person out there, but it's like unique enough for you to say, well, okay, that kind of feels more like my story, it feels more like my experience, and I've created that, I've had a say in that. And that's another way that creation can be used in games to be very compelling. So basically, to sum up, creation can be just as fun as destruction and just as compelling, but I think a lot of developers, particularly when they have these sort of $1 million budgets and these incredibly intricate engines, and they want you to look at specific things and do these very specific cinematic experiences, they're kind of more averse to giving you the options of creation, which invariably give more control over to the player. Ideally, it would put that kind of ideal 50-50 developer-player balance in terms of how the game comes together, in terms of how that experience is created. The developer, it's kind of like a 50-50, but you can kind of have a little bit of leeway either way. But the way it feels like now, it's kind of almost like 20-80. It's like the developer has so much say in these things, and that has so much to do with destruction, because the developer can sort of say, well, here's this building, like that bit in Crysis 2, where like a building falls over on top of you. I think either Crysis 2 or Battlefield 3. It happens in so many games nowadays that I just forget. It all merges into the same thing. But I think you needed the balance of creation as well to sort of have this optimal experience. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week.